did go through any of the articles, or did we read any of the additional stuff?
No, sir. No questions on my end.
No,
All
sir.
right. Okay, no problem. So we will look at starting with learning outcome 2 today. So continue our discussions on the Unit 25 Global Business Environment. And today we are going to be looking at learning outcome 2. So from yesterday, we understood, what is globalization, what is global business environment. We looked at, details of primarily going into understanding how and why companies would look at expanding internationally. And when they look at creation of demand, consumer demand, and obviously looking at expanding operations, that is where when we will generally get to see that companies or, businesses will expand, and international expansion will drive globalization. Now, there were other various dimensions that we discussed about, which are going to be important, the 5 dimensions which Sigrid had basically mentioned. And these dimensions typically include, cultural dimensions, technological dimensions. We had economic, political, and environmental dimensions. So these dimensions typically tend to create conditions where businesses can actually expand internationally. And when we look at the exchange of goods and services between countries, when it transforms, say boundaries or goes to different geographies, then in those cases, we also look at the development of, international trade happening. And that would be the theme of discussion in Learning Outcome 2 today, which basically focuses on determining the strategic complexities which are associated with operating in a global environment. So here, after we understood the business environment, the global business environment, what is globalization, and how does it, by looking at an example of Choco Talk as an example, looked at how companies look at growing their activities, and when their activities go beyond borders, then in terms of that, those activities then become international. International then, adds the dimension of growth. And when we look at growth, tend to, when I say they, I mean companies tend to expand. And when they expand to newer markets, they face competition, they get new consumers, they're acquiring new consumers. They obviously would need to look at legislation and requirements within a particular market, meeting the set basic government norms. And then obviously lots of agreements between different countries, nations. We mentioned or alluded to the term World Trade Organization yesterday. A couple of trade organizations like OECD, Asia, and NAFTA. These trade organizations then help facilitate or put together, let's say, contractual agreements between different nations, and then they help facilitate free flow of trade, which can happen. And that would mean, again, globalization, because companies are able to expand their businesses into different geographies. We looked at the 8 theories in terms of why the concept of globalization has come across and how it has evolved over the years. And these 8 theories predominantly focused on, putting a bit of perspective in, and then finally relating to the dimensions, the 5 dimensions, which basically, put these theories to use. One of the key factors that we looked at was discussing, the digital factors, which is the significant impact of, digital revolution, which is looking at, helping in globalization or expanding of businesses into international geographies. And this is because of the fact that Internet of Things, big data, and, some of the other upcoming technologies like blockchain, telecoms, 5G, and then we look at artificial intelligence allows companies to expand, because then it makes it easier for them to outsource operations to other countries, wherein the countries have both the nations or both the sides of the businesses have a bit of a win-win. In particular, there were 3 articles to be looked at specifically, which is driving the role of innovation in driving globalization. And then that is where we looked at the 3 small case studies, in terms of product innovation, product process innovation, and then business model innovation, which is taking up some of these examples which are given in the indicative content. So for here, we've replaced some of them. Obviously, we need to look at them, but in place of them, I've also suggested that we look at product innovation, which is Apple, process innovation, which is, essentially looking at so business model innovation, which is essentially looking at, the Tesla cars case study, and then process innovation, which is predominantly Toyota, by looking at, Kaizen just-in-time systems, and then obviously their implementation of improvements, continuous improvements in the supply chain management, which allows them to export cars or manufactures cars just in time using their philosophy. And this has now been incorporated by many companies across the globe in terms of specifically product and engineering and manufacturing companies, wherein they are able to save on inventory, warehousing, and obviously transportation, if they are able to manage supply chain in a way wherein most of the things are just available. When I say just available, I mean they are available just in time before manufacturing or requirements come in. Now, with that understanding of the learning outcome one, what we want to be able to do is go into learning outcome two, which is basically looking at what are global strategic complexities. We look at that in a bit more detail, just reconstruct this particular term. And then within that, we'll also look at what is international trade, how economics of globalization and environmental impacts of globalization can pose challenges to companies. Then we'll also look at the complexities of international supply chain management, discuss about things which are related to, predominantly, let's put it this way, the complexities which arise because of, say, differences in, culture, nuances which are required for transportation and logistics of things if they are manufactured in a big way in one geography, say, for example, in China, and then the movement of these goods which happens across the sea route or sea freight essentially to different parts of the world. We look at regulatory compliance, we look at trade barriers and trade tariffs which are introduced, which can affect the international supply chain management. And then in some cases, sometimes we talk about political uncertainties or, instabilities which can happen in various countries. So here we'll take an example of the ship which got stuck in the Suez Canal, I think about a year and a half back, and it basically created a lot of backlog in terms of supply chain management because the transportation of goods actually got into a bit of a, let's say, a jam, wherein the ship blocked the canal, and blocking of that canal meant that supply chains had to be adjusted for at least 6 to 9 months because the goods did not reach on time in certain places. So we look at that as a bit of an example in terms of how sometimes disasters or accidents or political instabilities would typically affect the international supply chain management. One of the key factors that we're going to discuss today in this learning outcome is going to be focused around what are the challenges and opportunities faced by businesses in the global economy. Now here, there are, these are actually bullet points. So there are a couple of factors that they've already suggested for us to look into. And these factors typically include legislation, which is when companies expand internationally, they have to look at labor laws, regulation, environmental, compliances, and those would be regulatory requirements that we look at. Then there are complexities of, obviously working across different time zones. So for example, in Europe, a lot of companies which typically outsource call center related facilities or sometimes manufacturing related facilities to companies or countries in the Far East, the time zone difference makes a lot of difference in terms of managing the operations. And we look at here some of the opportunities and challenges which the companies can face when they operate between different time zones. We look at cultural differences. So obviously cultural diversity, which is a key aspect. Sometimes companies have to look at product extensions. They have to look at the creation of new products, which will be meeting the requirements of the consumer in a particular territory because of their religious beliefs, requirements, and obviously their preferences. And that is what we will take up in this particular point. Then we look at the monetary environment. The monetary environment primarily is focused on understanding, how international trade is affected by interest rate fluctuations or exchange rate volatility that we talk about. For example, if the dollar to rupee rate changes, then how does it impact exports or imports? We look at obviously availability of credit in certain countries. Sometimes financial institutions and banking institutions do not provide enough credit because of volatility or because of reasons of, say, for example, insecurity or reputation, and then how does that affect the balance of trade? And then there are other factors which could be looked at in terms of, economic conditions. If there's a recession coming in, sometimes FDIs pull out money from that market. So we look at a lot of different arguments and points to discuss the monetary environment. Political unrest typically tends to be focused on, disrupting operations or business operations in particular, because of the fact that the government policy is uncertain or the political climate is uncertain. And it could also mean that if the government looks at nationalizing or decentralizing certain, industries or sectors within the economy, then in those cases, it can adversely affect the business. So we look at how does political unrest and incivility crop in and become a challenge or an opportunity for a business. And last but not the least, we're looking at, understanding how does managing global consumer needs, and so how big companies essentially manage, consumer needs globally. How do they look at managing their expectations? So in this case, sometimes we look at the Porter's 5 forces analysis, which is where the availability of substitute products or Me Too products becomes an issue or a challenge, for meeting the requirements of the consumer in a particular geography. And they could also be related to factors like demographics, which is varying, income levels. We look at sometimes language or communication barriers, or in some cases, certain markets, the consumers have very diverse preferences. So lots of different demographic factors would come in terms of how companies will look at managing, the global consumer needs and requirements. Now, as always, we are going to be looking at discussing this in detail. And for that, what I'm going to look at doing is basically looking at a PowerPoint presentation. So I've got a number of slides on the PowerPoint presentation to look at coverage and justification from a point of view of coverage of this particular learning outcome. But we'll discuss a couple of them in detail. Some of the slides are meant only for reading and obviously further reading purposes. And or in some cases, some of the slides that I've created would be adding on and providing you some information, which is to increase your background knowledge on some of the key elements of studying, global business environment. So this is the indicative content. This we've just looked at very briefly in terms of what all we'll be looking at covering. Let's start with some of the keywords which have come across in the learning outcome. Now, one of the things that we look at is strategic complexities. So when we look at defining the term strategic, in general, if I, obviously look at the word strategy and where does it originate from? So when we talk about the meaning of the word strategy, it's a plan of action designed to achieve a long-term goal or an overall aim or objective which the organization or the management has set. Now, strategy in business typically tends to be, related to the fact that your company is looking at identifying short-term and long-term goals. So when we talk about long-term goals, which could be 12, 18, 24, 36 months or 5 years, 10-year goals, and a roadmap is created within the organization, then is when we will say that there is some sort of a strategic viewpoint or a strategic paper available or a vision available within the organization. And this vision is then, obviously it gets molded, changed, modified, added onto, but at least there is a blueprint available for the step or the path which the organization is going to take in order to achieve its long-term goals. And that is why we will look at strategy. Now, when we talk about strategy, what it outlines is specific ways in which the organization would plan to position its products or services in the market and achieve its both short-term as well as long-term goals. Now, when we look at complexities, and if we look at, adding the word complexities primarily, to, let's say the word strategic, but in general, if we look at it standalone, complexity is basically looking at a situation or let's say a state wherein it is intricate. That means it's not simple. It's the exact opposite of the word simple. So it's complex means it is integrate, and it is complicated in the sense that things, when you look at working out at a level wherein there are lots of factors affecting it, then what you would generally see is that things would become complex or complicated. So when we talk about strategic complexity and obviously its meaning, we could have different connotations of how this would be seen across from a management point of view or from a company standpoint of view. So when we talk about strategic complexities, we are looking at talking about three different types of things which could affect the workings of the organization. So one such thing that we would look at primarily would be the part which basically makes, or factors which essentially affect the business and make it difficult for the company to operate within a particular environment. And these could be political issues. So when we talk about complexity, we look at the complexity theory, and in those cases we are looking at basically taking the help of PESTEL framework, which is looking at political issues, economic issues, socio-cultural issues, or environmental or technological or legal issues which could affect the workings of the organization. Now, the degree of complexity is also important, because to what extent is the company affected by that issue, for how long it is going to be affected. So for example, when we look at how long, or we look at answering the questions like how long and how many months, or how would it affect the company's long-term strategy, then we could look at we don't need to go far and look at the example of COVID-19. So COVID-19 as a pandemic not just affected one organization, one country, or a few set of companies in one particular sector. It affected all the companies, all the sectors, business sectors equally. Now, some did take, create alternative measures to be able to still offer and continue working in terms of operations, but some of the sectors had to totally shut down. So for example, if you look at hospitality, tourism, and in general services sector, they had to shut down totally because of the fact that at some stage the pandemic was at its height and government had introduced lockdowns. So these sectors had to totally shut down. But when we look at the workings of the bank, for example, the financial industry, look at telecoms in particular, these sectors continue to operate, although with limitations and under strict supervision. But this allowed at least the continuity in terms of business operations to happen. So when we talk about degree of complexity, is to understand how and where and how severe does a particular factor affect the company's long-term functioning. And that is what would be the second point that we will look at when we talk about strategic complexities. The third could be the number of elements which affect or number of factors which affect the company and its business. So in this case, whether it's competition affecting it, whether it's political climate affecting it, whether it's economic issues, recession affecting it, whether it's a pandemic like COVID-19 affecting it, or are the products of the company no longer relevant, and because they're no longer relevant and now being marginalized, they would be looking at the company and the management would be looking at understanding how they would now need to reorient their products or product structure to be able to make it more relevant for consumers in the market. So in terms of number of elements, we are looking at what are the different types of factors and going into detail for each of these type of factors to understand how it would affect the company and its operations. Now, this can be expanded to the company might be doing quite well. For example, Marks and Spencer's sale in the UK are declining, but when we look at overseas operations in territories like India, China, some of the other territories like Turkey, and it operates in European Union, those territories are showing significant growth, and obviously the business is quite buoyant. So in those cases, here the elements which are or factors which are affecting the strategy activity will have to be narrowed down to find out what is affecting the business in a particular geography and how those problems could then be resolved. So in some cases, when we talk about strategic complexities, we are looking at a combination of factors or a large number of combination of factors which could affect the business and its ability to make decisions. And in this case, this could be something which primarily can, require the company to, let's say, look at doing a bit of introspection or look at going into a bit of research and understanding why is it that their company or their operations are primarily being affected. So this bit would be looking at, the strategic complexities when we talk about businesses when they face, changes or, they work within diverse environments, and there could be different factors which could be affecting the business from outside. Now, when we talk about how do we look at, say, for example, undertaking a study in terms of dissecting some of these issues, we will be looking at, making use of PESTEL as a framework. And in those cases, you can easily segregate issues which could be segregated into 6 different types. And they would include things like political, economical, technological, legal, socio-cultural, and those kind of things. Now, that is the main overarching, reason why we will study learning outcome 2. Now, if I throw into the mix 1 or 2 other things, for example, what are the 4 basic strategies which companies would or countries or nations, or let's put it this way, economies and countries would actually put into place to look at strategic complexities? Now, there are 4 basic strategies, and they tend to be global standardization, localization, multinational or transactional. That means transnational, they would look at expanding operations to mitigate that, let's say the threat, and that is to look at expanding operations or the company becoming transnational. That means having operations in different geographies. And last but not the least, in some cases, when we talk about international, what would that mean is the company would be looking at shifting some of its operations to international operations. And in those cases, it would also mean that the operations, when I say, would also mean that the manufacturing side of things or the product and services side of things would also be moving to other geographies. And in those cases, internationalization would typically happen. Now, if I look at UK Versity, just as an example, and we operate out of UK in particular, if we were to expand and we create a brick and mortar model in countries like, say, Middle East, or in India, or in some of the other countries like Hong Kong or Singapore, what you're generally going to see is we can have a presence which is just going to be through the digital route. That means through websites and portals. And that would be allowing us to operate in those countries by following the rules and regulations. But that would generally not be true internationalization of our operations. That would say we are primarily, having operations in different countries. And that would mean that we have extended our operations across different, or say across national boundaries. And that is where it will be the meaning of the word transnational. That means we have, although a presence in Manchester, but we've increased our digital presence to be able to operate in other countries or geographies. And that is basically an extension of our operations through the digital route into other locations to be able to operate. And that would be termed as transnational. So when we look at the core operations of the company, in a way, staying within a particular geography, or the head office or the head of operations of that staying within a particular geography, then we will call that company or the spreading of that operation as transnational. But internationalization would mean we open a branch office in one of the locations, and that branch office has local staff. We have revenues coming in that location, and obviously banking and other aspects of the business also gets, they also start working in that location. And in those cases, that would be termed as internationalization. Now, in context to this, let's look at a couple of things just to gain and, look at some knowledge. Now, when we talk about obviously international trade and global business environment, globalization, companies expanding into other geographies to be able to do business and trade, we need to look at least understanding 3 or 4, key organizations. So what I've done is I've done a few slides on some of the key world trade, trade organizations, which essentially facilitate trade pacts, agreements, contractual agreements, and obviously, in this case, looking at creating a common platform through which companies and nations can, operate or do business in other geographies. Now, there are 4 such organizations I've taken through the route of looking at slides. And then because some of these organizations can be regional. So if I talk about NAFTA, which I just briefly mentioned yesterday, which is the North American, trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and US, that side of the agreements, or, sometimes when we say these agreements could be regional. So NAFTA is one such agreement. ASEAN, is one such agreement within the Southeast Asian countries. We look at OECD, which is again one such agreement but there are some international organizations which work across boundaries and across geographies. So they would be organizations like World Trade Organization. Now, WTO in short was obviously established in 1995. They're headquartered in Geneva in Switzerland, and 164 countries globally are, members of WTO. Now, the role of WTO is to facilitate and regulate international trade. So it helps develop mutually beneficial agreements between nations, and that allows companies and various businesses within the geographies to be able to trade without, or let's say trade with less paperwork and obligations towards regulation, when they are operating or trading with different, they're selling or trading their goods across different nations or different geographies. Now, the WTO is mainly responsible for trade negotiations, any sort of disputes which arise. So looking at dispute settlement, they look at monitoring international trade policy so that one nation does not have or produce policies or, lay out policies which can be more, protective of some of the resources or access, or, kind of looks at creating, let's say, hurdles for accessing those resources under the free trade agreement, which they sign up to. And in those cases, their main aim would be to look at regulating trade policies so that they decrease the amount of paperwork required between nations to be able to trade. And obviously, when I say nations, I mean, at some stage, companies essentially would be, doing this particular trading bit in terms of free flow of goods and services. And then they are also, obviously, one of the aspects they do is to do further training and provide assistance. And obviously, they cooperate within various countries and regulations which help in furthering, global trade. The second such organization that we look at is Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, which is APEC. And APEC is basically an organization established, in the Asia Pacific region. It obviously looks at, again, promoting, goods and services, and obviously conducive and contractual agreements between nations which are signed up on APEC. And this is basically the roles of such organizations would pretty much remain same, that they would facilitate contract, reduce documentation and paperwork, make markets accessible to companies and nations to be able to sell their products and services. And last but not the least, look at mitigating if there are any risks involved, and in some cases also look at dispute settlement. So this particular organization, APEC, was essentially, formed in 1989. It's headquartered in Singapore. There are 21 countries which have membership of this particular, let's say, organization, and its official purpose is to basically help regulate and grow trade within the Asia Pacific region. And then obviously trade liberalization, facilitation of business, development of economic and technical cooperation, looking at ways through which sustainable growth can be achieved by preserving natural environment and marine environment wherever possible. And then looking at structural reforms. If rules and regulations go out of date, then in those cases, this particular body would, facilitate that. Then we talk about, ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Now, ASEAN is obviously one such organization which is basically focused on, helping to develop trade. And, again, the same bits of APEC or WTO, but focused on, only the countries which are signed up as members of ASEAN as a group. Now, this particular association was formed or established in 1967, headquartered in Jakarta or Indonesia. And then there are 10 member nations which basically form this particular pact. And again, the main part is they facilitate. These organizations facilitate international trade or represent small, the bloc of these countries when they will look at negotiation with bigger economies and obviously other trade organizations. So there is a concerted support which these organizations provide to be able to negotiate and discuss trade-related agreements in a more conducive and economically better manner. Last one that we want to look at is OECD, which is Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Now, this is an intergovernmental economic organization which predominantly functions and looks at, coming out with policies, reports, prints, publishes research. And this is primarily focused on promoting, good economic policies which help in improving both the economic as well as the social status of people living within a particular geography. Now, they are a body which is more focused on shaping policies and obviously looking at developing collaborative agreements between governments, which will better the economic as well as social, let's say, side of things within a particular geography or a country. And they present and publish a lot of research reports throughout the year, year after year, and those reports are basically focused on, providing insights into economics and social challenges which countries or nations might be facing because of the increased amount of trade and mutual cooperation, which is in terms of promoting and expanding trade between nations, which is happening. Now, they were set up in 1961. They've evolved from a different organization called OEEC, which was predominantly a working organization in the European Union, and they are headquartered in Paris, France. They have 38 member countries across the world, and obviously their main aim, apart from looking at promoting trade, is to look at focusing on the main focus is on economic and social well-being of people living within those countries, and what is the impact of the trade agreements which it can have, which these agreements or collaborative agreements can have on the social and economic status of the people living within those countries. So they look at regulating and obviously suggesting. It's a non-governmental body or an intergovernmental body which basically does not intervene, but it provides a lot of advisory related services on things like taxation. How, say, for example, European Union, if you look at taxation across European Union, corporation tax, for example, Ireland has the lowest corporation tax amongst the EU countries, but it also looks at the rationale of why Ireland has to have the lowest tax, because, how does the country, look at, say, for example, its income, its GDP and things like that. So it will look at creating a rationale around it. And then, what is the, say, for example, an impact if a country looks at following suit and decreases further corporation tax, how would it start to attract, companies from overseas, which will set up subsidiaries there? And then how will it affect some of the other member countries in European Union? It'll publish a paper. So it basically looks at providing a rationale in terms of why the governments should look at working together, creating common policies or frameworks, and how can they develop and help in the betterment of the economic and social status of people living within those countries. So it is mostly focused on research, policy development, and also in terms of advisory, which is given to a lot of governments, which are governments of countries which are members of this particular organization. Now, the other part of the, say, for example, if we have to look at, so I've covered, say, for example, some part of the Asian agreements, some part of the European agreements. Let's look at a video on some of the other trade agreements which are available on the across the Atlantic. And these trade agreements that we talk about typically tend to be 4 different types, which is going to be GATT, we have the USMCA, the EU agreement, and the Mercosur and the World Trade Organization, which are responsible for driving most of the international trade, which is where the exchange of goods and services happens across various nations and borders. So this gives us a global perspective in terms of this short video that we are going to watch. And that global perspective would be to understand how international trade happens, and what are the various leading organizations and treaties which are in place, which help in the, which basically help in international trade across various countries, geographies, and continents. So let's listen into this particular video. Give me 1 second. Let me share that screen. Let me start from the start.
Let's look at the leading organizations and treaties in international trade, which is the exchange of goods between national borders. The leaders go by acronyms: GATT or GATT, USMCA, the EU, Mercosur, and WTO. We'll take a look at their individual roles. The first leader, GATT, or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, has the objective to reduce tariffs among all member nations. This trade agreement allows for the creation of the MFN, Most Favored Nation designation, which permits the designated country to export goods with very low tariffs and other beneficial terms. An example of the power of GATT can be seen in their ability to ensure a living wage worldwide. GATT fights for companies to pay above minimum wage to help working conditions. In 1995, the GATT actually joined the WTO, which we will learn about later in the lesson. GATT is considered a success as over 100 countries are members and covers 90% of world trade. The European Union, EU, was founded in 1993 as a successor to the former European Community. It allows 27 European countries to act as a single economic unit. It is founded on 4 freedoms of movement of goods, services, people, and money freely across borders. 17 of these countries use a common currency, the euro. The USMCA, or the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement, is the renegotiated version of the former NAFTA. Its purpose is to remove all trade barriers between Canada, Mexico, and the US. It has also reduced restrictions on banking and provided uniform protection of intellectual property. A leading women's cosmetic company called Mary Kay is one of the success stories of the former NAFTA. The ability to eliminate trade barriers and shorter processing times of business orders allowed Mary Kay to compete with Canadian and Mexican cosmetic companies. In addition, the company built a new corporate division in Mexico, leading to many new jobs. Mercosur is a regional trade bloc focusing on South America. Dating from 1991, the bloc currently consists of full members Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. 7 other countries have joined as associate members. Mercosur's purpose is to promote and encourage free trade and the free movement of goods, people, and currency among its member states. While specifics have changed several times, its current status is that of a customs union, in which members share a combined trade policy and free intra-trade zones. Taken as a single entity, the bloc generates economic activity of approximately $5 trillion annually. Reciprocal trade agreements have been signed with, among others, Israel, Japan, and the European Union. The last of the leaders is WTO, or World Trade Organization, which has absorbed GATT since its inception. The WTO tries to reduce trade barriers and governs trade agreements in areas such as agriculture and intellectual property. Each member nation of the WTO has to designate other member nations with the MFN status, leading to better trade. The WTO is unique in that it mediates disputes between nations. Every nation in the WTO is regarded with equal rights, so even smaller developing nations can challenge large ones. Not all countries want to cooperate with the WTO and regard their work as bullying. For example, the WTO can force companies to pay employees better wages. In addition, some decisions by the WTO can undermine a country's national law for the sake of trade. For example, the US tried to ban the catching of shrimp with the use of equipment that were harming endangered sea turtles. The WTO ruled that banning illegal, and the US could not proceed with their ruling.
So,
The WTO are responsible for overseeing the foundation of international trade, which is the exchange of goods between national borders. The objective of the GATT, or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, is to reduce tariffs among all member nations. The purpose of the USMCA, formerly known as NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, is to remove all trade barriers between Canada, Mexico, and the US. The European Union, or EU, is 27 European nations acting as a single economic bloc. Many share a common currency. The purpose of Mercosur is to promote and encourage free trade and the free movement of goods, people, and currency among its member states in South America. The WTO, or World Trade Organization, tries to reduce trade barriers and governs trade agreements in areas such as agriculture and intellectual property. The WTO is unique in that it mediates disputes between nations.
So as you can see, basically what tends to happen is that these are some of the free trade agreements that we, need to be aware of, as they would be, important, for information purposes, as far as, understanding the global business trade or, global business environment is concerned. So this video was focused predominantly on the, 4 or 5 major trade agreements, and that's why I covered some of the others, using, these slides so that we have good enough knowledge in terms of the major trade organizations which facilitate international trade, across the globe. Now, looking at some of the other aspects of this particular learning outcome, if we keep breaking it further. Now, one of the things that comes to your mind is when we talk about strategic complexities, why do we need to know about these complexities and how does it affect the global business environment? So when we looked at it in isolation in terms of strategy and complexities and then strategic complexities, now we need to create a relation of these complexities and how does it affect business in general. And that would be by looking at this particular question, which comes to our mind, which is, what is strategic complexity in a global business environment? So when we talk about the global business environment, we talk about a lot of trade which happens across national borders. And when we look at the trade happening across national borders or between different nations, what we do get to see is the free flow of goods and services, financial resources, or money essentially exchanging hand. And in terms, if we look at the recent trend in terms of technology exchange, which tends to happen in promoting, exchange of, or let's say, development of goods and services across various businesses. So in such cases, when we look at, the facilitation of trade happening across borders and removal of barriers, that is where sometimes companies typically come up and face what is called strategic complexities. So these could be things related to, say, anything which blocks the freedom or free movement of goods. It could be, if I look at free movement of goods, what would that mean? If I go into a bit of detail and put the thinking hat on, free movement of goods would be blocked by, for example, if there are natural disasters will happen, or for example, if logistics or supply chain systems are disrupted, that would disrupt the free flow of goods and services when I take it in its literal sense. So if the example of the Suez Canal being blocked by the ship, which typically, ran aground, what we do see is, the aspect of freedom, free movement of goods in terms of logistics, which basically happened, and that led to a major disruption in, global shipping industry, because it created a backlog or the ship Evergreen, if some of you recall, basically ran aground while passing, the Suez Canal, and that basically blocked the, the flow of container ships across the canal altogether for a couple of weeks. And that in general created, say, for example, logistical barriers. And that meant that companies which had goods being transported from China or other countries in the Far East, which was being manufactured and it gets transported to the European Union or European ports through the sea container route or sea freight route, meant that led to a blockage of trade. So 12% of all international trade or sea freight trade, which is basically driven, from Far East to Europe or other places, other continents, actually passes through the Suez Canal. And if that canal gets blocked, then what tends to happen is that, it blocks and creates, let's say, a kind of a traffic jam. And that traffic jam essentially means that other container ships or other supply vessels which were carrying goods which were meant for European ports did not, travel. So that this Evergreen, which blocked this particular canal when it ran aground, essentially is an example of how sometimes logistics transport systems, which basically in this case was being done through the sea route, created a backlog of how goods and services and prices went up in some of the European markets. And this evergreen, which ran aground, typically blocked 30 other container ships in the first instant, which were looking at crossing the Suez Canal or the Red Sea into the Mediterranean towards European ports. And that created, let's say, artificial, jump in prices because of the scarcity of goods or supply chain not meeting the consumer demand. When they know, when I say they know, I mean the planners know that these goods are supposed to reach the port, and from their transportation onto warehouses and distribution facilities and retail outlets takes that much time. So that created a backlog of 12 to 16 weeks and led to the increase of prices in certain European markets for certain goods. So this created a strategic complexity. That means business, say, for example, if you had ordered sofas or you had ordered some furniture and that was coming, from China, or if you look at IKEA, which basically has lots of different stores within the European country, and most of its supply chain comes from China. And you look at if this blocked some of the container ships carrying, material for IKEA, that meant that some of the products were not going to be replaced on time within the stores. They would create an artificial scarcity or, jump in, let's say, the prices because of the fact that these goods were not going to be available for a couple of weeks. And that would meant that companies, when I go down from nations to companies like IKEA would have had to take, put contingency plans into place to be able to ensure that they have enough supply or they are able to manage the expectation of consumers, because in some cases it can also lead to cancellation of orders, because if you have ordered something and you're waiting for 12 to 16 weeks, and if it's further delayed by 12 to 16 weeks, one of the threats which companies could face would be, the orders being canceled by consumers. And that would mean that the material, when it arrives, has no, is a cost or an expense to the company, because the orders against which, the material was essentially meant to be supplied to customer has now been canceled. So this creates a strategic complexity for a business if we do see hiccups like these happening within the supply chain side of things from an international geography point of view. And that is where the global business environment becomes important, is because it is no longer a case wherein, one side of the problems, or in this case, a second example would be the Ukraine war between Ukraine and Russia is not their problem alone, but it's a problem for a lot of countries in a lot of geographies. And that is, say, for example, the export of wheat, which typically happens from Ukraine, and the blockage of that trade grain deal between Russia and Ukraine means that the prices of flour and associated products like bread and other things begin to rise sharply in the African nations, which is where Ukraine supplies. Ukraine's wheat actually meets 60% of the demand, specifically in the West and East African nations. And that creates a strategic complexity from a national standpoint of view. But if we drill it down further, the war in Ukraine is not something which is their problem. It is a problem wherein the entire global trade and entire economies across various continents are affected. Now, one of the things that we also need to look at in this particular learning outcome is talking about international trade law. Now, what is international trade law? And if we look at just the very basic definitions of it, international trade law is a law which basically, creates a set of rules which allows goods to travel freely between different, nations. And this basically creates laws essentially which are related to the aspect of understanding, let's say, what are the minimum basics which the countries cannot do with, and in some cases these tend to be tariffs or barriers which is or regulatory compliances which tend to be which is required to be followed by companies which have international operations. So these trade laws are essentially nothing but rules or customs which govern trade between countries. And when we talk about international trade laws, what we are looking at is when we look at trade in general, it could be import oblique export, And this picture on the slide basically shows that if there's an exchange of goods and services happening between two different nations, then depending on whether the nation is importing it from the other country or exporting to the other country, they'll be labeled as import or export. And the laws and customs which govern the import and export of these goods between nations and countries, and in general, when I go down deeper between companies in different countries, they would basically constitute what is called the international trade laws. Now, if we have to look at what is the impact of the international trade laws, we need to also go into details of understanding why these are required and what kind of laws and treaties and conventions have to be taken into account, which basically fall under the banner of what is called the international trade laws. So when we look at international trade laws and we look at these international organizations in general, the ones that we talk about, the GATT, we talk about Mercosur or EU or ASEAN or APAC or OECD, WTO, these are organizations which basically govern the treaties, the conventions, and the laws, which then are, discussed and then put into agreement. And once these agreements are put into place, they facilitate the import and export of goods between countries. Now, sometimes these laws are governed when a country looks at signing up to an agreement or signing up to a particular law. These are governed by what type of economic growth and development is happening within those countries, and where would the dispute resolution happen if a dispute is to arise. So these trade organizations like the WTO, the GATT, and some of the others essentially play a very vital role in essentially looking at resolving any disputes which arise, predominantly when things, go sour. For example, if this particular bit, which I gave you an example of the Evergreen getting stuck in Suez Canal, at some stage, obviously all freight which moves by, sea or otherwise is all insured. And when we look at the insurance bill, which Suez Canal sued the owners of the ship Evergreen, they made, obviously the Suez Canal makes revenues by ships passing through the canal itself, and that is maintained by Egypt. So when we look at the bill or the counter bill, which the Suez Canal as an authority actually put on the owners of Evergreen, they basically sued the company for $1.2 billion. And this was estimated losses, which are losses in terms of revenue loss, which the Suez Canal faced because of the traffic logged, a situation wherein ships could not pass. So immediately 30 ships, insurance companies and other countries, basically filing claims, and a sum total of those claims, essentially, if I remember correctly, came up to about $1.2 billion. Now, if we have to look at this as a bit of a dispute, in the sense that, okay, the owners of the Evergreen dispute this and are not able to pay, then who would resolve this dispute in terms of money to be made available, and insurance claims to be settled? This would go into the court, and WTO or the World Trade Organization would essentially look at, resolving this particular dispute. So when we look at international trade laws, these trade laws are put in place to ensure that there is compliance and there is regulation. And if there are any disputes which arise related to different aspects of, say, for example, different aspects of these treaties or conventions or alliances, then there is a way to resolve them, amicably. And in those cases, these trade laws come into effect. Now, most of these organizations essentially, have conventions in very broad areas. But the ones which they generally regulate nowadays typically tend to be protection of intellectual property. They look at, obviously, international and labor standards, which is primarily environmental regulation. And one of the things which was seen in the video is that the WTO overtook GATT because they, looked at also ensuring that if companies outsource operations to other countries, they look at signing up to a minimum wage agreement, which is the minimum living wage that they have to pay to workers to be able to survive and obviously look after themselves within the particular country wherein the business is outsourcing those facilities. And we have seen that time and again in the news with Primark, H&M, Zara, and some of these companies which basically outsource manufacturing to countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, wherein a lot of the goods in terms of clothing and hosiery are manufactured on their behalf. They have to ensure that they pay minimum wage, minimum living wage in those countries to workers who are working within their factories, producing goods and services as per the requirements of, the companies. And these, broad heads that we look at are the heads which basically the international trade law actually governs. So looking at if there is an infringement of intellectual property, for example, in the US, Microsoft, filed a case that they lose a lot of revenue in China because of piracy of their software, specifically Windows operating system. And they lose billions of dollars in revenue every year in markets like India and China because of piracy. So here, the WTO is the Microsoft lobbies with WTO. WTO works in tandem with regional players to be able to put regulation into place, and relevant treaties and conventions are signed so that this could help in the protection of intellectual property rights of some of the software related companies, because for them, if somebody pirates the Windows operating system, then or any of the Microsoft softwares, then Microsoft loses revenues on that. And that is something which is an intellectual property of Microsoft, because they have created that particular software. So when we look at international trade law, we need to understand what all areas does it broadly regulate. So it looks at property, intellectual property, IP, or patents. It looks at ensuring there is standardization across various laws which are introduced by countries to protect their own let's say goods and services. They look at environmental and labor standards. They look at countries which are looking at diversification. But in those cases, say, for example, steel industry, if a country like India, if we look at, which was an importer of steel or, iron and steel a few years back, has now become a net exporter of steel. So in those cases, trade barriers or, essentially trade tariffs are levied onto if it is trying to dump cheap steel, like China was doing with solar panels a couple of years earlier, and the WTO slapped the two largest solar manufacturing companies in the world with fines to say that they could not cheaply dump this material in other countries, which would have meant that if they were local producers, then they were basically being shut down or closed, they were being forced to close down because of competition from Chinese, large Chinese companies which are volume manufacturers of solar panels. So in those cases, it looks at standardization of laws, and if there are companies looking at economic diversification, then some of the trade laws which are set in a way which are conducive to both local players as well as international players. And then we look at other points like reduction of trade barriers, protectionism, and retaliation. We look at inequality issues, and these could be, sometimes you see retaliation would be that if the US is to impose, let's say, duty or increased or levy duty on certain types of goods coming from China, China does the same in terms of retaliation by using retaliation to impose, trade barriers or higher customs duties on certain types of goods being imported from America, which makes these goods much more expensive and dearer, and as a result the companies are unable to operate or sell into those territories because of let's say governments not reaching a consensus in terms of creating certain trading laws or trade barriers. So in those cases, the international trade law helps, or the laws and treaties and conventions which have been created and regulates this particular facilitation of free flow of goods and services across borders. Any questions on this so far?
No, sir.
No.
Okay, the next bit that we want to look at in detail is basically focus on what is the economics of globalization. Why do companies look at essentially let's say expanding their operations globally, and why is it beneficial for companies to expand globally? So when we look at the economics of globalization, here we are looking at defining something which is related to a process within businesses that they need to look at, basically going into searching for newer markets, because the goods that they are producing, the services that they are offering are, surplus to the country or geography in which they are already offering these services or producing these goods or selling these goods. So in some cases, when they look at globalization, or when they look at essentially expanding to international geographies, one of the main reasons driving that is that their services have become, or their goods and services that they're producing have become surplus to the indigenous population. And in order to sell them and to make further profits, what it makes perfect sense for them is to look at the economic context of internationalization or globalization. Now, when we talk about, the example of, say, economics of globalization, we have to look at free trade agreements, and these free trade agreements typically, look at the concept of, okay, let's put it this way, not the free trade agreements, let's look at from a company's perspective first, that why do they look at localization or look at globalization? So one of the questions which begs most companies at some stage when they are meeting and having a surplus in terms of their production, they would at some stage go into, discussing what is called the, should we look at internationalization or should we look at globalization? So when we talk about internationalization, we are looking at the process where the company would look at increasing, its clout in the international market by supplying more goods, more types of services, and they'll be focused on increasing their, customer base. And this would more or less focus on internationalization. The results of internationalization would result in essentially the company creating more influence in certain markets by either tapping into local resources or tapping into the demands of consumers within that particular market, and that would drive internationalization. Now, if I look at the reverse or exactly opposite of it, which is globalization, here the company would want to drive globalization by actually integrating buying goods and services from local markets, which would mean that they would be creating partnerships with partners and suppliers within the local market and trying to create a permanent ground of serving, let's say the local, let's say the consumers in that area. Now, a simple example of this in terms of differentiation is assuming, and then that is where I'll go across to, trade laws and trade, agreements. For example, if let's look at Samsung produces washing machines, and it is this year produced a surplus of washing machines which it wants to export into a particular geography. So what it would do is basically look at the marketing, the BD and the export teams to get into a bit of an overdrive. And here what they would do is look at internationalization as a first step to basically start dumping or doing deals or creating deals with other countries wherein they could supply this product because of the surplus capacity. As long as they're making a bit of profit, they're covering their costs, let's put it this way, they would drive the sale of these products in different geographies in which they are not present, and that would be termed as internationalization. But over a period of time, if they realize that there is a growth, there is tremendous amount of growth potential which is available within a particular country, what they would then do is look at a systematic increase and a systematic stepping into that particular country by looking at studying the laws, making partners, gathering local partners and suppliers, setting up an international, or maybe in this case, when I don't use the word international, but setting up a manufacturing facility in that country, then this would be a part and parcel of what will be termed as globalization, because they are looking at local manufacturers, local producers, local suppliers. They are creating or opening up a manufacturing facility in that location. And this would mean that they would look at integrating into the local market from a global perspective. And that is where they would be driving globalization. The result of this would be that they will face less of barriers in terms of doing trade, because the company is seen to create employment within that geography. The company is seen to comply with laws and legislations which have been set by the government, and it leads to not just the let's say the creation of jobs for the local economy, but it also sees that the governments in some cases would offer soaps or some sort of benefits to the company because they're looking at creating jobs, employability, and in general economic well-being by coming into that geography to be able to manufacture goods locally and then sell those goods to the consumers in that market. This allows creation of partnerships, partnership with suppliers and local suppliers. This allows them to understand the culture, creation of jobs. In general, this benefits the economy and shows that the company is looking at integrating and taking into account cultural diversity and some of the other regards for law and legislation. And that is why this concept will be called globalization. Now, if you look at some companies in particular, after first they start off with the process of internationalization. So if I look at Sony, for example, selling televisions in the early 80s and 90s, all being produced within Japan, but the focus or the mantra on their side was Sony stands for quality. Sony's quality. It was very expensive. It was a niche market, but obviously they emphasized on the fact that they were basically looking at providing quality. And that is why people preferred buying something which was manufactured in Japan, although they were paying import duty, customs duty, and the cost of the goods was higher, but the focus was on quality. But at a later stage, when obviously other manufacturers and players started to come in and offer similar technology, Sony felt the need to be able to manufacture some of these goods locally in other markets and look at competing on price as well. They were not decreasing the quality, but looking at competing on their price in terms of shorter intervals of delivery and maybe creating more variants which were more suitable for the market. And that meant Sony opened operations or manufacturing facilities in various countries. And that meant that they went from internationalization to globalization. So when we look at the economics of globalization and the impacts it can have on the company, it then creates different challenges and opportunities for the company. And in some cases, these opportunities and challenges then lead to what are called diversification strategies. Is that point clear? Is that point understood? Because this is an important point. Why does a company look at, globalization?
To mitigate its competition or to balance out the pressure it is facing from its competitors.
That is correct. But when we look at a company choosing internationalization versus globalization as a route, one of the clear things that we see is that it obviously, provides the company different sorts of challenges and in some cases opportunities. And these challenges could pose risk, but in some cases, these challenges could also create opportunities. So when companies look at globalization, one of the key elements that we look at of globalization, why the company does is that it also looks at diversification. And diversification is a strategy which is used to manage risk. So if you look at Suzuki in India and Suzuki in Pakistan, or some of the other car manufacturers which are now entering the countries in particular, they see not just the growth happening because there is economic status, middle income status, and people being able to afford cars and the market growing, but they're also looking at diversification in general, is because they want to create models and variants which are going to be suitable for the market. For example, the road infrastructure in some of the countries might require changes to certain type of products, and maybe the suspension system, if I talk about in the case of automobile. In those cases, the company would look at diversification by creating a model which will be very well suited and matched for that particular geography. So although it creates challenges, they have a standard model that they produce and they want to sell in that location, but that standard model would maybe come back for more repairs and, because of the wear and tear of the infrastructure not being that good in certain places where they sell other similar model or variant in other countries. Here, what they would need to look at is diversification, and that would be to manage the risk and obviously meet the local requirements of the consumers in a long-term perspective. So sometimes when you look at diversification, and we look at globalization and challenges it poses, one of the things which comes out as an opportunity for a company is looking at diversification, because in this process, it allows it to basically mitigate or manage risk, and thereby looking at producing a product variant which allows it to be more suited for the local market. And when we look at these kind of challenges and we talk about diversification, obviously there are various types of diversification that we can go into. But when we look at diversification can be horizontal, conglomerate, concentric, but sometimes diversification provides opportunities for companies when they are looking at the process of globalization. So it might help them produce a variant which might be well suited for the particular market. And in those cases, if that particular variant might tend to drive more business than the variant of an automobile or a car brand which they're trying to bring, and then sell in that particular market. So in general, when we talk about the economics of globalization, the company would look at studying the impact the economics of globalization can have and what kind of risks, challenges, and opportunities it kind of provides to that to that company or for that particular product. So here, the economics of globalization would also mean if they expand into other countries, that would mean growth for them in terms of revenue. It also could mean if they manufacture the model locally, that could mean that it provides more efficiency, for example, and more, lowering of price in some cases by sourcing parts through local suppliers or partners in that geography. It could also mean that when they look at, say, for example, investing into opening a manufacturing facility, that could mean that they could also attract, government investment or, investment which could come in from FDIs to be able to help develop that manufacturing facility. And some of these facilities take, if not millions and millions of dollars to be able to produce, and a couple of years for this setup to be created, which is going to then drive revenue, for those companies in those countries. So we look at government legislation and compliance related to environment coming across, say, for example, in the automobile sector, taking that example, the introduction of, various types of, let's say, emission norms. So currently Euro 6, for example, is the emission norm, in terms of vehicular carbon emissions. So in order to look at bringing more efficient vehicles, the governments are also looking at bringing, let's say, regulation or policy towards introduction of electric cars in certain places. And that was to look at reducing the carbon footprint, basically the damage which automobiles are, creating in terms of global warming, in terms of an effect, in terms of an after effect. So here, the government will also look at, exploitation of natural resources or increased carbon footprint, environmental degradation, and, environmental awareness. So these are compliances which the company would need to come to grips with if it looks at globalization, setting up of a manufacturing facility, as an example, within a particular place to take advantage of local suppliers and contractors. Obviously, the benefits being it can help increase efficiency, bring more reliability because they are using local components. It will also maybe decrease to a certain extent certain types of costs. It could also do away with trade barriers or import duties, which the government would levy on certain types of parts if they're not being manufactured in a particular country, but being exported from abroad. All these will be benefits, but there also will be challenges which the company will need to face. And these form of challenges could be, say, for example, in the form of environmental challenges. And we could class them as 1, 2, 3, 4, like carbon footprint, exploitation of natural resources, looking at environmental degradation, and, in general, ensuring that the companies are, when they manufacture, they are also treating the waste and obviously not, polluting the environment in and around that, in and around that particular geography, which makes it conducive, for the environment in general to be, let's say, creates a conducive environment essentially. You can see and read about practical examples where this regulation and legislation has been applied. For example, in the Nigerian oil fields, Shell has been fined 140 million pounds or dollars, essentially, I think, because they, after the oil fields were abandoned, some of the oil fields were not properly, let's say, closed or dismantled. That led to the pollution of the local river in Nigeria. And obviously that has now seen a long-term effect, which is leading into the food table, the water table, and obviously contamination happening across with people facing serious illnesses. So the European Court has now fined Shell 200, I think in the excess of $200 million, and they've asked them to clean up the Niger Delta, essentially, by closing the oil fields in a proper manner. And this is after a 7 to 10 year litigation which has happened between the members of public and the local authorities, government in Nigeria, along with the company Shell. So here the environmental impacts of globalization can be seen. Although Shell is predominantly not based in Nigeria, it's a company based in the EU, but they are still under the common European court. When this was brought across to the courts, they had to, obviously defend themselves. And in this case, they've lost the case. And what has happened is, because there was substantial evidence available and they've lost the case, they've been asked to, obviously repatriate and, better the environment, or, take care and obviously close some of the things that they have not closed properly, and restore the environment by, not just imposing a fine, but asking them to work with the locals to, restore the local environment. And in this case, although globalization has meant that Nigeria is one of the major countries which produces oil, and Shell has a significant amount of investment in that country, but it has also been asked to, foot the bill for clearing up the environmental damage it has created, or its activities has created, in terms of, extracting oil from the Niger Delta. So these could be risks and challenges which the companies face when they look at globalization, the economics of globalization. It cannot be all good. Sometimes it can be looking at both the good and the bad sides. And in some cases, obviously, these expansions and globalization strategies tend to create more economic challenges for the company, rather than, in the long run, sometimes more economic challenges than positive benefits for the company. And that is what we need to understand with the use of an example here. So Shell losing, let me see if I can bring that article up. This is a good example to quote when we talk about say, for example, that is where it is. So if I show that to you, just as an example, and this is something which is an example of how economics of globalization and environmental impacts can affect, the operations of a particular, company. So this particular story, which basically UK court rules in favor of Shell in the Nigerian oil spill case, basically meant that they have now been asked to clean up and pay settlement costs and, clean up the operations, with regards to what the company has done when it is looked at, obviously, working and extracting oil in that particular region. So these are bits that sometimes you have to look at. And these are, I would say, additional stories that you need to look into when we look at some of them from a point of view of understanding the impacts and challenges which the companies can face when we look at globalization. So this particular story of the Suez Canal, if I put that across as a bit of additional reading, on the slide, are good articles to read to understand these, challenges which the companies face as far as, globalization is concerned. So I put them on as links, which you can read, after the presentation. Now, the next bit that we want to quickly discuss is the challenges and complexities that we face in the international supply chain. So the Suez Canal example of the Evergreen ship is, I would say, related to the international supply chain, because here, sometimes when you look at the complexities that we can face in terms of, natural disasters or, man-made disasters which can happen, can actually pose risks to international supply chain. So when we look at talking about problems which the supply chain can have with the, say, for example, companies facing labor shortages or availability of equipment, for example, or in some cases shortages which are created because there is less supply of or scarcity of certain type of products or elements, or let's say finished goods which are required to be able to produce further goods. Then in those cases we see shortages which can create spikes in prices. It can basically lead to spurring of demand, but that would also mean the goods becoming more expensive because there is a shortage in terms of the basic raw material which is required to produce those goods. Now, a couple of weeks back, there was an article, that there was shortage of chips shortage of chips, which are basically semiconductor chips, and those semiconductor chips, could affect the supply, or not supply, but basically the manufacture of cars. Now, increasingly, as you know, most cars or automobiles are using technology in terms of integrating satellite navigation, tracking, automobile tracking, and in general computer related aspects of it, because most of these vehicles now have what are called electronic systems. And chip shortage, which could which is a basic component required in certain components which are installed in the cars, could actually lead to creation of shortages in terms of production of cars happening because the chips aren't available. So when we talk about Ford Motor Company a couple of weeks back talking about that it was in talks with various other parties to look at sourcing alternate forms of chips, and it faced what are called shortages of chips to be able to manufacture cars. And because semiconductors are now more or less used in all various different types of products that we drive, use, or use them on a day-to-day basis, a shortage in the chips, which basically are basic building blocks to help in the communication aspects of it, can create shortage of product supplies or affect the supply chain. If the shortage of these chips, they create a short supply within the supply chain, and that could lead to shortages or longer durations of manufacturing for certain types of vehicles which require these. And in those cases, that would mean, as a customer, what does that mean for you and me? As a customer, that means that we will have longer wait time than usual to be able to get that product that we've ordered. So when we talk about global supply chain issues and how chip shortages would, say, for example, affect automobile manufacturers, there's again a very good article which was written by JP Morgan Stanley, and that is what I would also include here for additional reading. This would give you a current example of how in I would say April, I think earlier this year, they basically looked at the supply chain shortages in chips or semiconductor chips will essentially affect supply chain issues specifically for automobile companies. And these chip shortages would affect and delay the manufacture of cars by as little as 3 to 9 months, depending on which category or what type of car or car category that the customers are looking at ordering. So if it was expensive luxury cars, it could mean wait times of up to 9 to 12 months. But for normal general models, this wait time could be essentially anywhere between 3 to 6 months. So chip shortages in general are always in the news, as you've rightly mentioned, Nandish, that sometimes it affects manufacturing of graphic chips, essentially affects the manufacturing of PC and PC related equipments, and that would also mean that it helps us understand why supply chains have become quite important and why companies and countries in particular are very sensitive to shortages or factors that create these shortages within or affect the supply chain essentially within a particular sector or economy. So there could be lots of different reasons that we could look at, and some of these complexities or factors which can affect supply chain could be cultural differences, it could be logistics and transportation issues, it could be regulatory compliance, it could be tariffs and barriers which sometimes can come in. For example, if I look at countries like Venezuela, Cuba, you look at some of the other economies wherein there are sanctions or international sanctions being levied because of, let's say by the international community because of various reasons. You would normally see tariffs and trade barriers being brought into place. Russia, for example, is such an example because of the invasion of Ukraine. We look at currency fluctuation. We look at economic conditions, whether if there are shortages of any sorts of resources or labor shortages, or for example, availability of experienced manpower to be able to work within that sector. Then in those cases, it creates what are called diverse economic conditions, and that would mean that the companies operating within a particular sector in that geography might get affected. Availability of infrastructure. One of the clear things that I can put across is that although a lot of companies go into China for the reasons of manufacturing and setting up manufacturing facilities, it's quite clear. Why do they go to China, or why do they go to countries like Vietnam? And in certain sectors, specifically semiconductors or telecommunication or electronics, is because there's availability of specialty and trained manpower. Then infrastructure. So infrastructure does not mean just roads, railways, and bridges and stuff. Infrastructure means, for example, look at broadly wearing a hat and then imagining what all infrastructure would include. Things like 24/7 electricity, availability of natural resources like water or other resources which are required for the manufacturing of those products. Then availability of computerization, digital infrastructure, banking facility, looking at ports from which the export of these goods, once they are manufactured, can happen. So, for example, car manufacturing, IKEA, for example, manufactures in Shenzhen, and there is availability of ports for the goods to be transported across through sea freight, to different countries. So these are all things that companies look at when they look at the concept of globalization. And when they pick a particular country, they look at things like trained manpower, conducive government policies, very few or little trade tariffs or barriers. They look at infrastructure, they look at regulation, and then they look at also things like trained manpower, cultural barriers or language barriers, essentially, and what are the various laws and regulations governing environmental aspects in terms of particular geography. So these are all things which companies would take into account when they talk about expansion and globalization from their standpoint of view. And when we look at supply chain, these are the factors or barriers which the companies would essentially look at, which will help in streamlining some of the issues which they face when they look at manufacturing goods abroad. And then these goods are then brought into different countries through sea freight, air freight, for the purposes of retailing or selling, to consumers. So that is what we need to understand from a standpoint of view of, what are the complexities which can actually affect supply chain or international supply chain management. Is that okay? Any questions?
No, sir.
Okay, so let's look at a quick view on some of the challenges and opportunities faced by businesses in global economy. Now, I've created a few slides here which basically would discuss each of the individual points, related to challenges and opportunities, things like legislation, regulation across different time, working across different time zones, cultural differences or diversity, monetary environment, political unrest or instability, and then obviously how companies look at managing global consumer demands and expectation. But what I've done after that is basically created a bit of a table to discuss them, in general first. So I'll move the table up front. So here, if I just quickly reorganize one slide. Okay. So when we talk about in general, the challenges and opportunities faced by business in a global economy, there are 6 points that we have to discuss. So what I've done is I've created individual slides for each of the points, things like legislation, what could be the challenges and what could be the opportunities. So one slide for challenges, one slide for opportunities. Similarly, when we talk about, the second challenge, which is operating in complexities of different time zones, there are 2 slides there. Then we look at, cultural differences and diversity. Then we look at monetary environment. And we look at political instability or, essentially unrest. And last but not the least, managing global consumer demand and their needs and expectation. So I've discussed some of these points individually, but I think from a point of view of our perspective for discussions today, let's look at a table which summarizes pretty much everything. So what I want to do is look at all the factors which can affect and pose challenges or opportunities to businesses which operate within a global economy. So what I've done is I've created these factors here, the 6 factors that we're going to discuss in detail. And then I've listed down some common challenges and common opportunities across all these factors for the purposes of our discussion to keep it brief. There are these slides that you can go through in detail, and they would detail out some of these challenges and opportunities individually for all the 6 things that we need to discuss. Now, one of the first things that we want to look at and we discuss in this case is if we talk about legislation and regulatory requirements. What is legislation? Acts or laws which govern, certain set of operations of how companies, businesses will operate within a country. Now, some of the challenges could be that they could be quite complex. You could have complex laws which would be difficult to decipher and adapt to companies' operation, and that could pose a challenge. Sometimes this could mean that the companies would need to hire specialist teams or lawyers to be able to ensure that they can decode the laws and make them fit for purpose for their company operations. It also could mean that a company could be dealing with a plethora of different types of laws across different geographies in which they work. So you might have different employment law in France and in UK, in Russia, in Germany, in India, in Pakistan, in China, and that could be quite complex things for the company or the business to manage. And that would mean that they have to employ different teams, specialist teams in each geography to be able to work through these laws and ensure that they are the company's operations are compliant with it. The difficulty part of that is that it is spending a huge amount of costs in terms of ensuring that they are meeting that compliance and regulation in that geography. Now, the opportunities that it could obviously provide is that there are risks associated, but it could allow companies to expand to newer markets. It could also provide some sort of a competitive advantage when they look at they being able to successfully decode and use those rules and regulations to benefit their company as against their competitors. And last but not the least, it could also open up, opportunities for them in terms of private-public partnerships. That is where what we generally say is that the government, if I look at a prime example of Maruti Suzuki in India, so way back in the 1980s, 1983, I think the government of India signed a contract with Suzuki, and that allowed Indian government to own and start the operations of manufacturing Suzuki cars in India. And that was at a partnership of, majority partnership and ownership in terms of stake was with the Indian government, with partly 10% being owned by Suzuki. But over the years, as you can see, after 3 or 4 decades of development, now this has gone back into majority of what is Suzuki Corporation's control, which is a Japanese company, and the Indian government still remains a stakeholder. What they did was they publicly listed the company on the stock exchange, and obviously, benefited from such policy of liberalization and globalization, which it committed to by opening up the automobile sector way back in 1980s. There are similar such examples available in other economies, with other countries and with other companies, which meant that although at that point in time there was 200% import duty on foreign cars into India, and the government then looked at working favorably by changing the legislation and regulation to make it more conducive for more companies to come into India and start manufacturing cars. So this is one such detailed example of how we need to look at discussing challenges and opportunities faced by business in the global economy. Now, when we look at the second point, operating complexities across different time zones, what are the challenges? Think of things like scheduling differences, communication logs, and inefficient real-time coordination. So, for example, when we have call centers and certain side of operations being outsourced from the UK to Far East, the time difference 5-6 hours. In certain cases, what tends to happen is that some of these teams work, without supervision from the UK side of things when they're offering these services, because they are a couple of hours ahead of the UK time. And in those cases, real-time coordination or monitoring and supervision becomes a challenge. Now, opportunities could be obviously why it has been done. Outsourcing of business means cheaper costs. It means sometimes the companies can also have 24/7 operations if they want to look at increasingly servicing customer needs. And last but not the least, in terms of resource allocation, that means hiring cheaper manpower and maybe let's put it this way, more flexible and more knowledgeable manpower, but at the same time being cheaper because of the exchange rate or the outsourcing and why the company has done outsourcing. So you could look at some of these additional reasons by going through some of these slides and individually read them to understand that what are the challenges and opportunities which can be faced by companies which are working in a global or operating in a global business environment. Is that okay?
Okay, sir.
Now, I've also, towards the end of this session, looked at, addressing the, what is called the tasks which are given in the assessment grid. And if I just briefly show that, so in the assessment grid, there are 2 tasks. One is P2 and there is merit, which is M2. So in this assessment grid, the P2 talks about examining the complexity of strategic challenges faced by organizations when operating in a global business environment supported by specific examples. So this bit that we are discussing right now, which are challenges faced by organizations while operating in a global business environment, the 6 different points in this particular task, we have to look at picking up one of that challenge and explain that with a specific example, and that would help meet this particular criteria. And for merit, what you're looking at is evaluating the challenges in terms of risk and diversification. So whichever challenge that you've discussed in P2, for example, you pick up a challenge in terms of, I would say the, let's say the operating complexities in different time zones. So, or if you pick up that challenge of Suzuki, which I've given, for example, in terms of regulatory requirements, then what you would want to do is at some stage, discuss why the company agreed to mitigate that risk by looking at diversification as a strategy. And in diversification as a strategy, how it has solved some of the supply chain issues or supply chain management issues that we have discussed, and that would be looking at meeting the merit criteria. So I've given some pointers, in the slides on P2 and M2, and these, if you use some of these points to, do the tasks at a later stage when we discuss assignment, would be looking at stitching in an example or an organization in specific, and they would help you, obviously complete these tasks. So, for example, in this case, I've taken an example of Google, which is facing regulatory requirements by the European Union, and it was fined, nearly 4.5 billion euros because of breach of EU antitrust rules. And this is an example of how companies are facing challenges when we discuss regulatory and compliance-related environment when companies operate in different geographies. Another example that you can take is Facebook, which is also facing the similar challenge, Microsoft, which is facing a similar challenge, Apple, which is facing a similar challenge, and in those cases, data protection regulation, which EU now demands companies to store data of EU customers within EU geography only. It cannot be stored across in data centers or other locations outside the EU is having, so in companies like Facebook and Microsoft, they're having to face these fines because the data is not stored, and they've been asked to comply and obviously ensure that data is stored within European geography only. You could look at some of these points, the 6 points. So I've taken specific examples of some of the points so that it helps you understand and then look at addressing these tasks when we come to discussing the assignment. So economic disparities, I've taken iPhone sales pricing strategy for India, for example, or some of the developing countries. It introduced the iPhone mini, or it works on a strategy of reducing the cost of an older model when it brings out a newer model in that geography. Manufacturing a lower model or one generation lower model in a geography like India to be able to address the market is an example of economic disparity because of simple reasons that people are not able to afford the latest model. So in this case, an example of an iPhone. Political instability in terms of Venezuela, which is looking at sanctions and currency control. So certain countries like Zimbabwe, Venezuela, which are facing political instability, and their inflation is out of control. The currency and exchange rates, are no longer valid. The mechanisms from the monetary perspective are no longer valid. So in those cases, look at political instability, and you can pick out different examples that you feel comfortable with, and then consider one of them for the purposes of doing the P2 task. And then similarly, when you expand that to merit, you're not looking at doing a separate task, but in this context, whatever challenge you've taken, you're further, building up that challenge. But in this case, relating it to diversification and how does the company solve some of the supply chain issues would help you address the merit criteria. Now, there are some additional readings which I've uploaded up on Moodle for today's learning outcome. And because we're going to be meeting next week, what my suggestion would be at some stage is to go and make sure that you read some of these articles and the additional, reading material that I've mentioned. And that would be useful for the purposes of building a bit more detailing into what has been discussed, in today's session. So just very briefly showing you, the Moodle in terms of, what has been uploaded. So let's have a quick look on that before we close the session. So if I look at Moodle on Learning Outcome 2, that's the presentation that I put up here. There are some reports from the World Trade Organization, which I've uploaded, which could be a good read, for Learning Outcome 2. And some of the things that I've discussed, they would provide you detailing into international trade laws, the amount of trade which is happening, various factors and, parameters which are affecting international trade. There is some detailed analysis on some of these reports that you would see. So what my session would be essentially to go through and skim through some of these reports. So if I just quickly log back in. So they are quite detailed and extensive reports, but the idea is to basically skim through some of these reports to understand, some of the challenges which the companies face. And that is the first report. This is the second one in terms of trade tariffs and policies. And obviously, these are latest reports, which are quite detailed, but you might need to read certain specific sections of the report just to get a good idea in terms of challenges and opportunities, and what are the changes in rules which have happened predominantly, across between last year and this year. So depending on which country or territory you feel look at, my suggestion would be to read a few pages and get an idea in terms of how these organizations facilitate international, trade across, various countries. In addition to that, I think I've shown you 3 or 4 articles. One of them, relates to the blockage of Suez Canal by the huge container ship. Then we were looking at the court ruling, which is related to legislation, and then supply chain issues in terms of shortages due to semiconductor chips. That could also be a good read, in addition to what has been, provided on, in terms of, the reports that I've provided on Moodle. Any questions on this so far? Tell me.
No, sir.
Okay,
Yes,
so
sir.
I'll put these links on also, the presentation, so that you have them, available for the purposes of also reading through there as well. And that's something that you will find in the further reading section of the slide, which is generally the plenary slide towards the end of the presentation here. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good stuff. So as I mentioned to you, there is a good amount of reading to be done in this unit to bring up your knowledge. And obviously, that is what I would suggest that you do for the balance part of next week. And we'll be discussing when we start next week. First session will be a discussion on the assignment brief, for Learning Outcome 1, which covers, Unit 25, Learning Outcome 1 and Learning Outcome 2. And then that will be followed by Learning Outcome 3. And then we'll move the sessions over by 1 week. Will be followed by Learning Outcome 4, then an assignment discussion on Learning Outcome 3 and Learning Outcome 4. So until then, thank you so much for joining in today, and hope to see you next week for the discussions on the assignment and the further sessions.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, and bye for now.